Think about the last time you pulled up to the gas station. You know the feeling. You slide your card into the reader, and you just stand there, watching those numbers climb higher and higher. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a quiet voice asks a very simple, very frustrating question.
When exactly did this get so expensive? You probably filled the tank, drove away, and honestly just tried not to think about it too hard. But here's the stark reality. That completely ordinary moment at the pump, it's directly connected to something much, much larger. We're talking about something happening thousands of miles away that most of us just didn't see coming.
In today's Explainer, we're mapping out the exact mechanics of a war that started quietly. It's a conflict that is literally reshaping the financial lives of millions of American families for years to come. We're going to look closely at your gas bills, those rising living costs, and that growing, heavy sense of financial stress, and we're going to trace it all back to the source.
Section 1. The Global Choke Point.
So let's go back to late February 2026. The United States and Israel launched military strikes against Iran, and within hours, the world changed. Not in some flashy Hollywood movie kind of way, but in a quiet, practically invisible, and deeply devastating way for the average American household. See, the absolute focal point of this disruption is a narrow strip of water in the Middle East called the Strait of Hormuz. Now, it's just 21 miles wide, but get this, roughly 20% of all the world's oil flows through that tiny gap every single day. When the conflict broke out, that strait essentially became a war zone. Shipments were disrupted, maritime insurance skyrocketed, and the global oil supply tightened almost instantly.
And the brutal math of this disruption is just undeniable. Think about it. When supply tightens up, but our demand stays exactly the same, prices absolutely explode. Crude oil surged past $90 a barrel. It jumped from $67 almost overnight. That is a sudden increase of more than 30%. And the worst part? That number hasn't come back down.
Part 2. The Everything Ripple Effect.
Here is the thing we often forget. Oil is the invisible engine of our entire economy. You know the plastic packaging holding your groceries? Made from oil. The diesel fuel powering the trucks delivering those groceries? Oil. What about the fertilizer growing crops on American farms? Derived from oil and natural gas. Even the electricity powering the lights in your home relies partly on these resources. Certified financial planners are warning us that, unlike tariffs, which can take months to actually trickle down to us, oil price increases hit consumer costs almost instantly. It's like a tidal wave crashing into literally every corner of the economy.
Section 3. The Human Cost. Let me introduce you to Tom and Sandra. They're a real couple in their mid-60s living in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. Now, before the conflict, they were managing things carefully. Sure, they were already a bit stretched by previous price hikes, but they were hanging in there, planning for their retirement. But let's look at their current reality. Tom's fuel costs, just to get to his part-time job, have jumped $40 a month since February. Sandra's suddenly paying noticeably more for basics like ground beef, eggs, and bread. And on top of that, their utility rates are adjusting upward. Now, Tom and Sandra didn't start this war. They have absolutely no connection to the Middle East, but they are the ones paying for it in ways that are slow, quiet, and absolutely relentless.
And Tom and Sandra are far from alone in this. According to a Gallup survey from April 2026, a staggering 55% of Americans say their personal financial situation is actively getting worse. Let that sink in for a second. That is the highest figure ever recorded in the history of that survey, rivaled only by the absolute darkest days of the Great Recession. Right now, more Americans feel financially worse off today than at almost any other point in modern history.
Part 4. The stagflation trap.
This brings us to a massive, looming economic threat. It's a word that really sends a chill down the spine of anyone who lived through the 1970s. Stagflation. So, what is this exactly? Well, stagflation happens when inflation, meaning your rising cost of living, goes up at the exact same time that economic growth slows down and jobs become scarce. It is essentially the worst of all possible worlds. You're paying way more for everything while simultaneously earning less or constantly worrying about your job security.
As one prominent economist pointed out, these higher oil prices are, quote, a negative supply shock, lifting inflation and hurting growth at the same time, putting the Fed in a no-win situation. And that really hits the nail on the head. You see, the Federal Reserve usually fights inflation by raising interest rates. But we all know higher rates slow down the economy. So if they raise rates now to stop inflation, they crush economic growth. But if they lower rates to protect people's jobs, well, inflation just spirals even higher. They are completely trapped. And when the Fed gets stuck like this, your mortgage rates, your credit card interest, your car loans, they all just become painfully expensive.
Section 5. The $36 trillion problem.
$36 trillion. That is the current staggering size of America's national debt. Just to keep the lights on and the government functioning, the U.S. Treasury has to borrow more than $2 trillion this year alone. If you do the math, that breaks down to over $166 billion being borrowed every single month.
So what happens when oil prices rise and inflation climbs? Servicing this massive mountain of debt becomes incredibly complex. The interest payments alone are consuming a huge share of the federal budget. Think about that. That's money that could otherwise be protecting things like Social Security, Medicare, or veterans benefits. Now, the conflict abroad didn't create our debt problem, obviously, but it has absolutely made it vastly harder to solve. And as we all know, eventually those harder debt problems, they always fall squarely onto the shoulders of the American taxpayer.
Part 6. The cost to your future.
If you're in that critical 40 to 70 age bracket right now, the implications of all this are just severe. Already, 62% of Americans are actively worrying that they simply won't have enough money for retirement. And these global energy shocks, they basically attack every single pillar of your savings. Your stock market investments, totally vulnerable to the massive volatility that these global conflicts create. Your bond portfolio, highly sensitive to the Fed's interest rate changes. And worst of all, the fixed income you actually plan to live on, things like pensions or Social Security, it literally loses purchasing power every single month that inflation stays elevated.
The reality is, the war nobody fully warned you about is already sitting right there at your kitchen table. It's woven deep into your energy bill. It's hiding right there in your grocery bag. And it's quietly, slowly eroding your retirement account. It's this relentless financial stress that just seems to get a little bit heavier every single week, completely driven by these global oil prices and the looming threat of stagflation.
And so, well, it leaves us here, trying to do math that just no longer seems to add up the way it used to. The global oil markets remain completely on edge, and the very institutions designed to protect our economic stability, they're standing at a crossroads with absolutely no easy path forward. It forces all of us to look at the news, look at our draining bank accounts, and ask the solemn question that millions of Americans are asking themselves right now. Is anyone actually in charge? And does anyone up there truly understand what this is doing to ordinary people?